Good evening. I'm Deborah Gall, and on behalf of the Newport Beach Public Library and the Library Live series, welcome tonight to the first of our 2015-2016 Library Live series. Before I introduce Marie, I do want to mention to you that one of the joys of being involved with this jewel of a library is the opportunity to discover new voices in literature. And tonight you will discover, if you haven't already, Marie Mutsuki Mockett. The library that we have is really unique, and I invite you all to become involved and be a donor to the Library Live Foundation, or the Library Foundation. So if you need more information on that, I'm sure that there's some packets you can pick up on the way out. I want to thank Nespresso and Fashion Island for hosting tonight's coffee. That was really terrific. They make great coffee. And tonight's book sales are courtesy of Lido Village Books, who donates a percentage of all of their sales to the library, and we very, very much appreciate their patronage. And Marie will be signing books in front of the room after the talk. So thank you, Lido Village Books. And of course, I must remind you to turn off your cell phones, unwrap your candy, and suppress any germs that have decided to activate and cause you to cough. Okay, that aside, you are in for a treat tonight. And I dearly loved discovering Marie Mutsuki Mockett's memoir, where the dead pause and the Japanese say goodbye. You know, everybody in this room reads for different reasons. And in my case, a few of those reasons are to learn something new, to plumb history for reoccurring themes, to connect to the hero's journey, to be transported to a different place, to be uplifted to a different plane, to learn about myself against the backdrop of someone else's struggle, and then simply to enjoy a compelling story. And I found each and every one of those aspects in Mockett's memoir, where the dead pause and the Japanese say goodbye. I was touched by her wisdom and insights and found great comfort in her stories of people transcending unspeakable tragedy to again rise strong. Marie Mutsuki Mockett, and I defy any of you to say that 10 times. It is more difficult than Peter Piper picked a peck. It's very difficult. Marie Mutsuki Mockett, I'm practicing. She was born to an American father and Japanese mother and grew up in Carmel, California. She graduated from Columbia University with a degree in East Asian languages and civilizations. Her memoir, Where the Dead Pause and the Japanese Say Goodbye, was published by Norton in March of 2015. The book examines grief against the backdrop of the 2011 Great East Earthquake and Mockett's family temple, which is located only 25 miles from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power reactor. A 2011 op-ed in the New York Times about the 3/11 disaster led to Marie's featured participation in the internationally televised documentary Venerating the Dead. Mockett's awards include a fellowship from the U.S.-Japan Creative Artist Fellowship, which is founded by the National Endowment of the Arts. Her novel, Picking Bones from Ash, was shortlisted for the Soroyan International Prize and was a finalist for the Patterson Prize. Where the Dead Pause and the Japanese Say Goodbye was a New York Times Editor's Choice, a Barnes & Noble Discover pick, and an Indie Next pick. Of this book, Zen Buddhist priest Ruth Ozeki has said, "Read it, you will be uplifted," and it is advice I wholeheartedly endorse. It is my pleasure to give you Marie Mutsuki Mockett.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and warm welcome. And thank you everybody for coming tonight. I'm Marie, and I did write a book called Where the Dead Pause and the Japanese Say Goodbye, a curious title, I know, which will hopefully, the meaning will become a little bit clearer by the end of the evening. As I was putting together this talk for all of us, I started to call it something else in my head. And I have been referring to it as How to Enlarge Your Heart, because though it is a book about overcoming disaster and tragedy, I feel like if you're going to overcome disaster and tragedy, the benefit has to be that you have a larger heart and have some kind of redemptive experience. And that's what I'm hoping to share with all of you tonight. And I will also say that one of the reasons why I was able to explore this theme in Japan is because Japan is a very old culture, and so a lot of people have thought about this question for many generations. What do we do when we're incredibly sad? How can we enjoy our lives? And I feel so lucky that I was able to go to Japan and meet with people who have the benefit of the many years that something like this has been thought over, and to bring it to you. I'm going to start just by reading you a little bit of the beginning of my book. And if you have read my book, I'm going to provide you with some images so that you see a little bit of the faces and the places that appear. And then I'll talk a little bit and we'll go on from there, okay? On March 11, 2011, I woke to a text from a friend alerting me that Japan had been jolted by an earthquake. At first, I dismissed the news. Japan often has earthquakes. I'm originally from California, and we too often have earthquakes. But the urgency of this message intrigued me, and I eventually got out of bed and inspected the news on the computer. This was no routine earthquake. I checked the epicenter. It was 8.9 or 9.0 on the Richter scale, and 130 miles off the coast of Sendai. Reports streamed in that the earthquake had triggered a tsunami, and a graphic of Japan showed an increasingly wide area of impact. The coast of Tohoku, the northeast region on Japan's main island, had been eviscerated. Even though it was morning, my husband poured me a glass of wine from a bottle we'd half drunk the night before, and I sat and watched the internet with the radio on in the background. For 36 hours after the earthquake and tsunami, I was unable to get any word from my mother's family, who own and run a Zen Buddhist temple in Iwaki, a city about 85 miles from Sendai on the Tohoku coastline. 36 hours does not seem like a very long time given the distance from Japan to New York where I lived, but this waiting period felt akin to a week. Friends phoned and sent emails and texts. I called my mother in California and told her not to go to the beach. Japanese temples, especially older Zen temples like my family's, are often safely located high up on a hill. This is because a temple is supposed to bring you closer to Buddha and to the gods, who almost always live up in the sky out of mortal reach. Tsunamis usually impact coastlines, but this particular event was so powerful the water infiltrated rivers, scaling heights previously considered secure. I watched the images as they were updated, looking for any indication of my family's fate. A photo came in from Onahama Harbor, the seaside port in Iwaki. I picked up the phone again. Nothing. Before the tsunami, the great tragedy that everyone skirted in conversation in my Japanese family was World War II. On August 9th, 1945, my great-uncle was out fishing in the Pacific, far enough away from Nagasaki, Japan, where he lived, that he missed the immediate impact of the atomic bomb dropped that day. My great-aunt was in their new house outside Nagasaki. The entire family had fled the city only a few days earlier because my great-uncle feared a repeat of the bombing of Hiroshima. I had heard this story many times during my childhood. Back then, it made me feel that my great-uncle was a clever man. But as an adult, I realized he was also very lucky because cleverness alone cannot keep you safe. I wondered if my family in Iwaki would also be lucky and smart. I wanted to know, and I did not want to know. I kept dipping into the world of the internet with its videos of water raging over the farmland and crushed ferries, and then quickly backed out. Not looking at the videos kept reality at bay, because the images of the coastline did not match the Japan that I knew and loved from childhood. In the Japan that I know, I boarded the Joban line train from Ueno Station in Tokyo and traveled up the northeast coast to Iwaki. If it was spring, the bento stalls in Ueno Station sold cherry blossom-themed meals to eat on the train or in the park, pink cakes made of mochi rice paste cut into flower shapes. The train would stop at Kairakuen, a park in the city of Mito that is famous for its plum blossoms. And here I will interject that it is also famous for the historical figure of Mito Komon, who, despite living in the 17th century, had his own hit TV show from 1961 to 2011, and was therefore a formative part of my childhood. Here he is miraculously revived in the park that belonged to his fiefdom. I found him walking around one day with Miss Mito on your left. And of course I had to take a photo and explain what was going on to my son, who's in the picture there. Not long after leaving Kairakuen, the train curved along the tracks and began to hug the coast. Then I knew that I had entered Tohoku, the northern region of Japan, where the goddesses and demons of legend seem alive and seafood is sweet. My Japanese grandfather was particularly fond of mehikari, or seafood. Often on this journey, I would switch to a local train to get off at Nakoso, a town famous for its inns and hot springs, and formerly a way station on the footpath connecting Tohoku to Edo, which is the ancient name for Tokyo. And here we have, I think, an 18th century print of the gate that would mark the barrier between Tohoku and the path that would continue on to Tokyo. And here's what it looks like today. It's one of the nice things about Japan is they preserve a lot of these historical places. My favorite spa, Sekinoyu, is just yards off the beach, a vegetation-thick cliff at its back. The waves of the North Pacific crash right outside the windows. This is my mother explaining to my son that the sun is rising over the ocean rather than setting over the ocean, because we can do that in Japan. And it gives you a sense of how close the water was to the window. I did not see how the spa could have survived the tsunami. Its website was eerily still online with numerous photos of ocean views through the windows of the bathing room and the dining rooms. No status update was posted on its main page. As a child traveling through Japan with my mother, I kept an illustrated journal of our adventures. In one entry, I was swimming in the waters off the beach at Oarai, a town located on the Tohoku coast whose name means big washing, which sounded romantic before the tsunami. Now Oarai was covered with sludge. In another illustration, I was standing under the gigantic chandelier-like ornaments of Sendai's famed Tanabata Star Festival. But Sendai had been pummeled and its airport closed. In yet another diary entry, my mother was knee-high in dark blue water and holding an umbrella while I clung to her back. I remember laughing as my mother carried me to the safety of an elevated platform, but we were also afraid. What if the flooding did not stop? All these towns had a beach. Whenever we visited the beach, my mother would ask, "What do you do if the water suddenly disappears?" "Run," I would answer. "Why?" She would fire back. "Come on, why?" "Because it means a tsunami is coming," I would sigh. Whatever that was. And here's the ocean at rest. So that's a little bit of the opening of my book. That's how it starts. And I want to tell you a little bit about where I was during this time when this tsunami happened. I was newly married and I had a little son, who you saw in the photo, and every reason to be happy. But I had also lost my father, who was really my very best friend, kind of a soulmate kind of connection. And I had also lost my Japanese grandparents, and that had the effect of making me feel like whenever I went back to Japan, I would be going as a tourist, which was not a good feeling. And I think that happens to a lot of people when you sort of feel cut off from your hometown. You think, what happened to the personal connection I had to this place that means so much to me? And so I was very, very, very unhappy and very depressed. And then the tsunami came and really just unsettled me very deeply. I don't know how much any of you might know about Buddhism, but the first thing that you're supposed to accept about Buddhism, and I really resisted this for years, but the first tenet is that all human beings suffer. And when my father died, I knew, because I had been a good student in school, that all human beings suffer, but I hadn't really learned what deep grief was like. I had this funny experience earlier this year where I was on a radio show with a talk host who was also a grief counselor, and she said, "You know, Marie, when I started reading your book, I felt like you were lost in a cave, and you were just feeling your way around in this cave, and you couldn't get out." And I thought that's a really good metaphor for grief, when you're sort of lost in a state of just desperation and hopelessness, and you can't tell anyone, and you can't get out. And as we got to talking, I remembered I have this section in my book about a cave, because in fact, I had been to visit a cave in Japan. I had been taken there by a documentary crew, and they had said to me, you know, this cave is very sacred. You can think of it as being kind of an intermediary plane between the living and the dead, and it can also sort of be a metaphor for what it feels like to be lost in grief. So, we're going to start our journey in the cave, and then we're going to come out. Here's what I wrote about the cave. We inched our way down the rocky entrance into the grotto, and then we were inside. Almost immediately, there was a shift in the atmosphere. The air was moist, like breath. It had a voice. Soon I would realize that this was because the cave was actually a cavern that led all the way through the rock and out to another entrance, which opened up to the sea. As the wind rushed in from the ocean, it was compressed and it roared. I was deeply unsettled. I could hear the ocean outside, but I could not see it. And the thought occurred to me that if a tsunami came in at this particular moment, I would not see the water rushing in and we would all be trapped. There was very little natural light and no vegetation, and the rock had a wild, anthropomorphic quality to it, like it was the hide of an animal. The floor felt very rocky and uneven. I felt claustrophobic, but up ahead I could see some light, and I began to work my way through to the other end. Here and there, unrescued statues of Jizo, a Buddhist deity, lay in the sand. In one area, there was a tangle of toys, mixed in with flotsam and jetsam. I hurried toward the other mouth of the cave and stepped out onto the beach. The air changed, as though the cave had exhaled and sent me back into the bright light of the living. So, what's going on here? This is a sacred place, an unofficially sacred place, meaning that townspeople have kept it very, very, marked it as a special place of pilgrimage for generations. And kind of a strange thing. Why do people come here? What is the experience? Well, I'm going to give you my scholarly explanation first, okay? This cave, or cavern, is an example of something called sai no kawara in Japanese, which we know has existed in the Japanese imagination as far back as the 14th century. And you can think of sai no kawara as a transitional space. It's a bit like a portal to the other world. Not all sai no kawara are located in caves. They are always located by the water. Okay? And the one that I was in, that we'll talk about a little bit more, was particularly effective because it was a cave. But these are transitional spaces, and people will in Japan decide that a specific location represents, metaphorically, a portal to the underworld. And that means if you are grieving because you have lost someone, you can go to that space and say goodbye to someone, or tell them that you miss them. And I think because there's sort of a scary quality to them, it kind of mirrors the way that people feel when they're lost in a feeling of grief. And this was deeply upsetting to me the first time I went. And over time, I came to kind of respect it because it was very honest. You know, when you're very sad, that is how you feel. There's a lot going on in this picture. I don't know everything that's going on here. There are people trying to get across the river. There are some demons who are making life difficult, as they do in every part of the world. And you can see some stone towers. And sometimes when you go to places called Sai no Kawara in Japan, you will see stone towers like this. The idea is that if you build a stone tower, you can climb the stone tower and go on to the next world and be reborn. However, it's not that simple. There is an old woman, and there is no politically correct way to say this. All the scholars call her the old hag. Although even though she's an old hag, even in the underworld, she gets to have a consort, and that's him on the right. And she tells the demons to go knock over the stone towers. You just can't win. She tells the demons to go knock over the stone towers. She also, as the dead appear before her, because she's the first entity that the spirits of the dead meet, she either takes their clothes or their skin, because if you were poor, you wouldn't have been buried in clothing, and hangs it on a tree. And then depending on what the tree does, you then get your next assignment. So this is all very bleak. There she is, people saying, all right, fine, here are my clothes. And she's hanging it on the tree. And then depending on if the branch bends this way or that way, they have to go get judged, or they immediately get reprocessed and reborn. No one really seems to know the origin of Shozuka no Baba, the old hag. Although I've read that some people think there might be a correlation to what they call the old crone in Russia, which would make sense, right? Okay. I think this paints a rather explicit picture of death, but of grief. It's not a very happy picture. Imagine my surprise then, and I write about this in the book, where I came across a temple dedicated specifically to the old hag. And I write about this, and I'm not going to read the whole description, but I have this story in the book where my 3.5-year-old son and I are standing on the platform of an altar at a temple in the middle of the north of Japan. And there was a priest who said, "Are you looking at the box on the altar?" And I said, "We're looking at the box." And he said, "Okay, here we go. 3, 2, 1. And the curtain in front of this box flew open, and out flew, like a jack-in-the-box, the figure of the old hag with teeth. And it was really kind of scary, and my son let go of my hand and ran away. And I had one of these moments of, am I being a terrible mother? I'm definitely being a terrible mother. Am I being made fun of? I bet I'm being made fun of. Or am I being shown something really important and culturally important, and I have to be respectful? It was probably some combination of all of those things. The priest folded up the statue. He said, "Your son will be fine. I know children, your son will be fine." He was right. And he said, "I want you to think about the statue." He said, "When we think of grief, we think of the front of the statue and how scary the face of Shozuka no Baba, the old hag, is." He said, "However, if you look at her from another angle, how does she seem?" And I said, "She seems very sad." And he said, "Yes, that's right. She is very sad. She's very sad that this happens to us and that she has to be responsible for it." So I wrote in my book, many months later, I started to think about the old hag a little differently. She whose job it was to terrify and to torment knew exactly how horrible her actions were, and a part of her grieved to have to do this to us. But her job was also necessary. For months, I had been looking to return my life to the way it had been before my father and my grandparents had died. And when I couldn't do that, when I couldn't bring them out of the underworld, I had felt the touch of madness. Old Baba had been trying to tell me that it would be impossible to heal my wound by resurrecting anyone who was dead. If I insisted on trying to do this unfeasible thing, then the world would only be reflected back to me as it appeared in Old Baba's most obvious expression, with fury and scorn, and indeed this was how my surroundings had looked to me most of the time. But if I went about things another way, if I could in fact accept that my world had forever changed, then I could see grief as it was depicted from the side of Baba's face, with sadness, but with compassion for others. And I should note here that this is not a photo of the actual statue that I saw because I was not allowed to provide the photo to you. But I think it gives you a sense of how the scary figure kind of has two different expressions. So, okay, so this is all very good and well, and we've all been good students and examined this figure and understood the lesson, but it's still upsetting. I personally, I believe in willpower and that we can all help ourselves, but I also would like to believe that there are figures of hope who will help us. And fortunately, there is a figure in the Buddhist canon who's there. There he is on the upper right-hand corner. His name is Jizo, and he's an extremely popular figure in Buddhism. He's arriving on his lotus blossom. That's how we know that he's what they call a bodhisattva, an enlightened being who has stayed behind to help us. He's beaming some rays of light. He's beaming the ray of light on one of the demons. He's got little children and souls of people who need help in his robes. And he's going to help them get across the river. And off in the distance, you can see a kind of a golden palace. And people will make it to the other side and will continue on their way. And that is Jizo. A very, very beloved figure in Japan. And that is why, here's a picture of the entrance to the cave again. In the front on the right, you see there's a statue with a bald head and a red cape, and that's Jizo. And that's why, even though this cave was scary, and I really didn't like going in it, it was full of statues of this figure, so that people could go and have that feeling of passing through a cave, but be reminded the entire time that there's somebody there to help them. Jizo is extremely popular in Japan. You could just be walking anywhere, in a park, even in a city street, and you might find a little tiny figure like this. This is Jizo. We know it's him because his head is bald. He's not really wearing any jewelry, and he has on his red cape. Sometimes he's hiding the souls of, children or anybody who's lost in the underworld, hiding them away from the old hag and helping them. And that's why you'll see him all over Japan. And here in the back of the cave again are more of these figures. I think one of the things that I came to realize then, as I spent all this time thinking about all of these different elements and of this cave, is that, in fact, it's really important to realize that we are not actually disconnected from the people we lose. I write in my book, maybe it was wrong to look at this place, the cave, as being so menacing. Maybe the point was not that too much grief was dangerous, but that, like the cave, I was supposed to remember that life and death are connected, that those people I loved were gone, but still retained a connection to me. My world was connected to theirs. And this brings me to something really important I learned in Japan. And I say in my book that grief is not a one-way street in Japan, because as much as we miss the people who are gone, in Japan we believe that they miss us too. And this is why once a year they come home. Usually in August there's something called the Festival of Obon, which is kind of like a combination of Thanksgiving and New Year's Eve. And people flood home. If you were to fly to Japan in August, the plane would be full of people from Japan going home to welcome their ancestors home. And you would go to a temple. Wherever you were in Japan, you would have a different way that you would do this. But you would bring home the spirits of your ancestors and spend time with them. This is a photo of a bell in Kyoto, and you can see people are lined up. They're all strangers, they don't know each other, and they're all taking turns pulling that rope, which rings a bell, and the sound from the bell travels up to the other world and brings home the spirits. And the woman who's holding strips of paper in her hand wearing black, those are the names of the people who she's going to call home. In Japan, when you die, you're given a new name because it's just like a rebirth, so you get a new name. So these strips of paper have the new name on them, and so we're able to say, I'm calling these specific people home to come and be with me. And then Obon gets underway. And we have a version of it in the United States. A lot of Japanese Americans celebrate Obon. And it was a big part of my childhood in Japan. When I was a child, I thought Obon was a chance to wear a really nice kimono and put on makeup and go dancing with the adults at night. I didn't realize that we were performing for the ancestors and making them happy. This is a picture from one of my journals when I was probably 5 or 6. And here is a picture of what Obon dance actually looks like. In the book I write, women and children dressed in traditional outfits assemble in a circle, and as a singer's voice began to slide up and down the pentatonic scale, the dancing began. The dance movements were easy for anyone to pick up on the spot or to dredge up out of their memories. Obon movements are slow and often stylized gestures that reference hoeing and fishing. It was not uncommon for men and women to join the procession and to continue on in a circle and then drop out when they felt like it. I love that in Japan. The men just get in there and dance too. There are different kinds of Obon dancing. There's a town in Tohoku called Ugo, which has the Nishimonai Bon Odori. And it's kind of amazing. The entire town gets together and practices once a month, and they put on this Obon dance for tourists. And what makes it unusual is you have two kinds of dancers. You have the ones with the straw hats, and you have the ones with the black over their faces. And the black hoods are supposed to represent the souls of the dead. And so you have this visual impression of the living dancing alongside with the dying, or with the dead. And this presentation is put on for people. As the dancing continued on deep into the night, it became impossible to discern where the looping line of dancers repeated. Every now and then, one figure, usually a woman, would come by, and she would have such a silky clarity to her dancing, and her robe would be so carefully and beautifully handmade. It was clear that she prided herself on her accomplishments. Most of the time, though, the movements were in sync, the outfits coordinated, and I couldn't tell one dancer from the other. And the effect of this is that you really end up feeling like you're watching the living and the dead together. And the best thing is that you're watching it with everyone else. So there's a real feeling of community. You realize everyone has lost someone, everyone is wishing someone were with them. And there is a really healing effect in doing these sort of communal activities, as we are doing. So all too soon, it's time to send the souls home. And there are different ways to do this. One that I like is called Toro Nagashi, or lantern floating. And this is another thing that happens all over Japan. Here are 2 of my lanterns, and I have written down the names of some people who I have called home and I'm about to send back. And because it's Japan, everything's really efficient. You give your yen, you get your lantern and a pen, and you write the names down, and then you get on a boat. And I did this in Matsushima, which is one of Japan's most scenic locations. By now, it was quite dark. Several boats set out from Matsushima to deposit lanterns. And soon the sea was awash with pinpricks of light mirroring the stars overhead. It was humbling to consider that each lantern most likely represented more than one person. The number of deceased people for whom we were collectively grieving was enormous. Far away back on shore was an even brighter cluster of lights where people were dancing. This brilliant island of light looked so inviting. And I thought to myself that this was what the dead would see as they left us. I wondered if this final image was as bittersweet for them as it was for me. And after a while, I noticed something odd. The lanterns bunched together. They were riding the currents, of course, but But the overall effect was as though the lanterns were traveling in clusters, as though some of the souls out at sea were in fact not alone, but traveling home to the horizon with each other. So, from this Toro Nagashi, from the lanterns clinging to each other, as they're just tossed around by the ocean, that's just what ocean currents do, to the synchronized bell ringing, everybody getting a line and ringing a bell, and the dancing, I kind of started to learn the same lesson, and it is this. People are not actually alone. And this was the start of my understanding that I couldn't shrink my own grief, right? I couldn't actually make it smaller. But if I cast it against the backdrop of a larger human experience, if I had more compassion for other people, then in fact my pain would grow smaller. And so in a way I'm trying to say, our hearts can only grow larger when we are able to feel more compassion for other people. And of course that's one of the central tenets of Buddhism. It's not that dissimilar from Christianity, which asks us to love our neighbors as we do ourselves, right? So the title of this book has the curious phrase, where the Japanese pause and the dead say goodbye. Yes, that is right. In addition to exploring these traditions and others, right, this book is often described as a journey. And the ultimate physical destination that you could take if you were in Japan is to go to a place called Osorezan, which often gets translated to Mount Doom. And here I usually tell people that the original title of the book was The Journey to Mount Doom, until the marketing department said, people will think you've written a Tolkien book. So that's why we have the curious title. Osorezan, despite being called a mountain, is actually an extinguished volcano, so there's no peak to the mountain. Things in Japan are not always what they seem to be. This is an instance of that. A lot of Japanese have never been to Osorezan, but it looms large in their imagination as a mysterious place full of ghosts. In the old days, pilgrims would cross this red bridge over the Sanzu no Kao, which is like the river Styx. And after they did that, they would feel they were entering into another world. The place smells very strongly of sulfur because it's an extinguished volcano, so there was a lot of vapor rising up. You all are in Southern California, so you'll understand when I say it's kind of like Death Valley, where you're sort of close to the center of the earth and you're seeing the mysterious inner workings underneath the earth's crust. That's kind of what Osorezan or Mount Doom is like. There are these strange rock formations, and it is eerily quiet. There's really nothing that lives. Here's our friend Jiso, because even though we're in this very barren and desolate landscape, we are reminded that Jiso is there to help us. People see in the upper kind of left-hand corner, there's a rock with some names on it. And that's probably left by someone who's missing a departed person and has written the name down to say, you have now, gone into the other world, but I'm here forging my connection with you. And you can see how the rocks just kind of pile up. They say that in the old days there was a lot more kind of volcanic activity, and it's calmed down a little bit. If you've read my book, then you know that that Mount Doom is famous for the blind shamanesses who commune with the dead, and that people stand in line for 7 to 8 hours in order to have a session with one of these mediums. There are only 2 left. I'm sorry, this is the only photo I have. I was very sneaky when I took it, but there she is. And she calls herself the last Itako, the last blind medium, even though she's not blind. It's the land of exceptions. But I write about my experience with her. The other funny thing about Mount Doom is, because it is in Japan, it has a bureaucracy, which means there's a vice president. And I met with the vice president and had an hour session with him, and I talk about that. One thing he said to me, he was a character who told me that his nickname was Darth Vader. And I think there was a reviewer who said that I made too many pop cultural references, and I thought, what am I supposed to do when the vice president of Mount Doom, the underworld, tells me that his nickname is Darth Vader? I feel like you have to put that in a book, right? Because it's true. So he said to me, you Westerners, this is Darth Vader, you like to know what you are doing. You would like to know why you are doing things before you do them. Only then will you do what you're asked to do. We train our Japanese differently. We make them do things, and then they learn why later. And then he went on. The point of Buddhism is that it is natural to live with wounds. Everyone has wounds, and everyone will be wounded, and this is different than your Christianity. This can be shocking at first, but in fact, it is completely normal. That's basically it. And so it was with grieving, he said. Intense grieving was recognition of this wound, and it always took a person some time to grow accustomed to it. When I traveled around Japan, I had repeatedly asked my ancestors to make me feel more happy than sad, and in a way this had happened, but with one important difference. It was not that my sadness had shrunk so much or that my happiness had grown. Instead, I now saw my sadness in the context of everyone else's grief. I am, after all, just one person on a planet of millions, all of whom, if they have not already, will also suffer these same intense feelings of shock and loss that I have, and many of them will do so in far more traumatic settings. My little lantern of grief was but one in a sea of other lanterns. So, what can I share with you after having gone through all of these strange experiences in this landscape? There's a wonderful Japanese scholar who's unfortunately passed away. His name was Kawai Hayao. And he has this idea about Japanese fairy tales. He says, in many Japanese fairy tales, the conflict in a story is resolved by what he calls the aesthetic solution. In the West, the hero's virtue is rewarded by a happy ending, but in Japan, beautiful endings are much preferred to happy endings. Beauty is the ultimate democracy because a beautiful thing, particularly if it exists in nature, belongs to everyone. We know this because we live in California, right? So here I have to introduce the concepts of wabi and sabi. The simplest definition of wabi-sabi is that it is a kind of beauty whose highest form is expressed through imperfection. When I studied this in college, the art historian Mieko Murase would say, consider the full moon glowing brightly in the sky. But how much more beautiful is the moon when it is partially obscured by a bit of cloud? A geometrically symmetrical tea bowl is a lovely thing to drink from, but how cold and precise it looks beside an earthen tea bowl whose surface is slightly marred. The Japanese love the beauty of cherry blossoms in the spring. However, say the aesthetes, how much more beautiful are the cherry trees and the blossoms when they are past their peak and the petals begin to drip onto the ground. And this is why the Japanese celebrate the cherry blossom. And of course, as Californians, you too know the power of nature, and you know that just looking at it has the power to restore you. In Japan, it is the cherry blossom that is seen as having the biggest impact. So it is that I write in my book about visiting cherry blossoms in the city of Kyoto. As we rounded the temple balcony, I saw a doorway ahead flanked by a massive wooden pillars. Peeking through the darkness, was a shocking bright pink light, cherry blossoms. Around me, the air felt electric. We passed through the doorway, through the portal, and were suddenly in another world. The temple seemed like a ship suspended on the waves of hundreds of pink flowers, both above and below us. These illuminated cherry trees glowed like the strange ethereal gases you see in the photos of distant nebula. Hayao Kawai writes, The Japanese fairy tale tells us that the world is beautiful and that beauty is complete only if we also accept the existence of death. Beauty heals us, but we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that perfected beauty is any kind of true antidote to suffering, for everything is always changing, never holding fast to its shape. Everything must one day die, and we are all always just passing through. So it is that we might heal a bit by experiencing the passing beauty of a dance gesture, a fading ghost, or a flower, and that we do this together. Thank you. Should we do some questions? Do you have any questions? Yes? So the question was, how much of my childhood did I spend in Japan? And the person asking the question lived there from 6 to 8. It's a really impressionable age if you were there from 6 to 8. I think it forever changes the way you see. So my first trip to Japan, I think I was 2.5. And then I went back with my mother when I was 4. And we would go every summer and would spend anywhere from 2 months to 2 weeks. And we did this year after year after year. And what I remember is when we would stay for a long time, especially when I was little, I would forget English. And I had this very strange experience of coming home from Japan and seeing my father waiting for me at San Francisco Airport on the other side of the glass, before you went through customs, and being so nervous because he was tall and he had a pointy nose and he was Caucasian. And I had completely become Japanese in the way that I saw people. And so I was going like this because I was so shy. And I remember in the car home, I wanted to tell my father I had milked a cow, and I couldn't remember how to say I milked a cow in English. So I said to my mom, how do I say I milked a cow in English? And she'd say I milked a cow. So it had a really big impact on me and just on the way that I saw, and I have learned that the way that we see is kind of plastic. It's elastic, it changes, and then another culture can actually cause you to see a landscape differently. And they've now done tests where they have found that depending on what culture you're in, you will in fact see a landscape or see a crowd of people differently. It's kind of fascinating. So, follow up, yes? You don't see the man in the moon. So there's a story about Japan. It comes from China, but that they believe there's a rabbit. Do you see the rabbit in the moon? Yeah, I see the rabbit in the moon. I like that. Any other questions? Yes, in the back. Oh, my dress, thank you. It was a last minute switch, and I'm really glad I went with it. Thank you. Okay. So the question is, how does my family own a temple? It's a really good question. So in Japan, in general, temples are owned by a family and are then passed down from the father to the oldest son. This is a very old-fashioned. We think of Japan as being really modern, and it is, but there are these sort of feudal practices that still exist, not only in a temple, but in a business, where you would want to take the family business or the fiefdom or whatever and pass it on to the oldest son. So it's kind of like the British monarchy, right? Where every family wants to make sure they have Prince William and Prince Harry. And that's the case with my family, that there are 3 sons, so they have the heir and the spare. And then there were problems, which happened several generations ago with my family's temple, where the sons all died. And my grandfather, who was supposed to inherit the temple, said, I don't want to become a Buddhist priest. That is not for me, and ran away, like he abdicated. And so my great aunt kept this thing going, and then, in the manner of a Charles Dickens novel, found the illegitimate child of one of the deceased male brothers, and went and said, come and be at the temple and you'll make a lot of money. And his mother, who was 17, said, absolutely not, you're not taking my kid, and shut the door. I'm not making this up. And Sempo, who's my mother's cousin at 30, suddenly thought, I'm going to go and claim my birthright, and cut off all ties with his mother and became a priest and reclaimed his family birthright. And then eventually, after his adopted mother died, he was then able to formally recognize his real mother. I mean, this is the sort of thing that happens in Japan, and I'll sit with Buddhist priests and we have this whole conversation about, so how did you pass on your temple? Oh, you adopted a son who married the daughter who changed his name to her last name, and then did you have any boys? Did you have, oh, you had a boy, that's good. You know, that's kind of how it goes. And it's not, a lot of people say it's not really a supportable system forever. And there are young people who don't want to become priests, or who end up deciding that they want to become priests. I met a lot of guys who said, I'm not going to I'm not taking over my family's for me. And then they went and worked in corporate Japan and said, I think being a priest is a really good idea, you know, and turn their back on corporate hours. But that is how it works. And so this particular temple has been in our family since I think my great-grandfather took it over, when the previous family totally died out. And then there was a frantic call for a new family to come and take it over. So probably more information than you asked for, but that is in fact the way that and there are businesses that work this way too. I think I have one story in the book where actually the reason why Darth Vader went to Mount Doom was because the priest who currently runs Mount Doom only had a daughter. And she couldn't become a priest, so she started going to Eiheiji, which is the main Zen monastery in Japan, kind of looking to see if there was a man who might be interested. And there was, and they got married. And so he changed his name to her family's last name to now run this temple overseeing Mount Doom, and they had a son. So, yes, and the...
I'm interested in the connection between Zen Buddhism and Shintoism. It seems as if Japanese are very worship nature, almost a connection to nature with the cave, bridge,
Yes.
as symbols to the other worlds, and that Shinto was the original religion, and animism before that. But, the reverence for nature, is it there today? Because Japan is supposedly the most forested country in the world. 74% of it is covered by forest.
So the question was about the connection between Zen Buddhism and Shinto, which is the indigenous religion of Japan, and included a statistic I didn't know, that Japan was the most heavily forested country in the world. I talk a little bit about it in the book. So Shinto, every single history book contains the same line. Shinto is the indigenous religion of Japan. Everyone writes it like that. In fact, I probably did that too. And it is a nature religion. The scholars posit that there are 8 million gods and demons living in rocks, in trees, in mountains, in people, in animals, and so in trees, and this is why cherry trees are cared for. These old 300-year-old trees have like a special cherry tree doctor, who's like the 30th in his family because he has to go to a son, to inherit the role of caring for the cherry tree. And then Zen Buddhism, which came over from China, where it was called Chan, and was heavily influenced by Taoism, which is also kind of a nature, where I'm being very simplistic here, but also very nature-centered. So Zen, just at its roots, has a consciousness of nature and of the beauty of nature. And you're right, these things do sort of go together very well. The history is, let me see if I can get this right. When Buddhism entered Japan, they don't know exactly when, but let's say around the 6th century, there was this pre-existing tradition which we now call Shinto. And the people in Japan didn't know it was called Shinto, they just knew that this thing called Buddhism came in and it was different from what they were practicing. And there were a lot of fights over what to do about this. And ultimately it was decided, to make history very simple, by a prince called Prince Shotoku, that Japan ought to be able to have Buddhism and Shinto at the same time, and that this should not be a problem. Can you imagine that happening in the Western Christian world? We'll have the Judeo-Christian God, and we'll keep all of our pagan gods, and that's just fine. That's just not the way it went in Western Europe, right? I mean, we have our Christmas trees, and we have the Easter bunny and Easter eggs, but we pretend that those things, all came under the umbrella of Christianity. And that's just not what happened in Japan. They were able to sort of maintain this distinction, and there have been wars between different sects throughout history, but for the most part, people are able to kind of maintain what for a Westerner would seem like a total paradox, but which is not for them. There's a scene in the book where I'm talking to the film crew. Everyone's drunk, except for me, because I'm responsible. And the film crew starts out by saying, "We're not religious." And then they say, "Oh yeah, well, when I go to a shrine, and then if that one doesn't work, I go to another one." And that's a great thing. If that doesn't work, you can go to another shrine and pray to another god. And if that doesn't work, you can go to another one. And I was thinking about that TV series Rome, which was on HBO. And you would see the ancient Romans, like, if they were all jealous or whatever, they would go to Hera and say, "Please enact revenge on my enemy." And then if you needed a love potion, you'd go to another temple. I mean, it was like that, I think, probably even in the Western world at one point, this sort of flexible thinking about sacred power, that kind of all disappeared. As for whether or not the Japanese are still nature worshippers, they will tell you they're totally secular, not religious at all, and no, they're not. And then I will say, why then, when it's September and October, why does McDonald's run a moon viewing burger campaign? Why, when you introduced the Infinity car in America, did you think it was a good idea to show lots of pictures of running water and trees? This is not how we appeal to the male desire for a superior vehicle in our country. We don't show lots of pictures of running water, right? We show manly things. That's what makes you want to buy a better car. So there is a different way of thinking. I could go on, but the advertising, I think, is one of the clearest indications of just how different their thinking is. Although it's funny, young people will say to me, and here I'm saying I'm not young people will say to me, "Yeah, but I like their advertising." So there's some kind of cultural seepage that I think is happening now, and it'll be interesting to see what the result of that is. I think you had a question, Toby.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the whole concept of stress and competition in schools leading to suicide, which seems to be almost endemic to students who are trying to get into top colleges.
Yeah.
But how do the Japanese deal with that whole idea of suicide and the whole attitude toward competition?
How do the Japanese deal with the idea of suicide and competition? Well, nobody likes suicide. It's a shameful thing. It's very upsetting. It's upsetting to parents. It's a culture that, maybe this is a very simplistic explanation, but it's a culture that really valued cooperation and teamwork, and still values cooperation and teamwork, and is part of our modern world where competition is extremely important and the individual excelling is extremely important. And I think that's it's a very difficult thing for them to adapt to. And it's an old world. It's not a new world culture. I mean, we're in California, which is like the newest of the new. So if you want to start your life over at any point, you can. This is much more difficult in old cultures anywhere, even in Western Europe. You're sort of on a track, and there you are. You're in your class, you're in your job, you're on your path. It's really hard to start over. And Japan is no different in that respect. So it's kind of decided early. Are you a good student or not a good student? What school are you going to go to? And as a result of going to that school, what kind of a job are you going to get? But of course, anybody who lives in the modern world knows that the world is actually full of possibilities and full of options. Young people know that. They get on the internet and they see that. And that causes increasing stress. I don't really have an easy answer, but it is something that mental health professionals talk about all the time, and there is a growing mental health industry in Japan, but there's also a lot of talk about how to tailor that to the Japanese culture. And for the most part, I think because there is a strong commitment to social behavior in Japan, there's a feeling of wanting to take care of others and sort of carry them along, like that's the nice thing to do, you know. You're having a nervous breakdown, go rest, come back when you're ready, is the sort of, oh, you're having another one, go rest, come back, we'll cover for you, go rest, come back when you're ready, rather than, what is the source of this, is there medication that you know, what changes can we make? And you know, Japan is a less flexible society in many ways than ours is. But there's also a great deal of beauty, obviously, in being part of a culture that has a kind of a real social commitment. They used to joke in the 80s and the 90s that there was only one real socialist country in the world, and that was Japan. It's a great place to be middle class. I mean, everything is great if you're middle class in Japan. So, yes?
Did the horrible traumas of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have a tendency to make Japan a more secular society?
Did the horrible traumas of Nagasaki and Hiroshima tend to make Japan a more secular society? It's really case by case, I think. You know, I really can't say what the statistics are. There are people in my family who emerged from that. Some of them became Christians. Some absolutely refuse to believe in any sort of higher power. And I might have my mother's cousin says, man is a cancer, man is a virus, man is a terrible creature. I'm like, I don't want to listen to that, you know. I have a little kid. I still have love and hope for humanity. But the kind of existential wrestling, and there were also some seminal figures after the atomic bombs who said these were sent to Japan in order to teach us, how to be better, I guess. It was a sort of a divine, and then there are people who said that's nonsense. This was a terrible thing. Don't tell me that people who were burned did this for any sort of a reason. But you know, that kind of very Judeo-Christian thinking, should I believe or should I not believe, is not a question is not a conversation you really have in Japan, because at heart, it's not, the culture isn't do I believe or do I not believe. You don't turn on the talk show and see people saying, did God create the earth? Should I believe in evolution or shouldn't I? Because there are 8 million gods and demons and Buddha, and nobody believes in any of them except when they need to, and then they go to each shrine, right? So there's for Westerners, it's like, what? I just don't understand. But for the Japanese, it makes a lot more sense. And I think my personal belief is it's because people in Japan understand the concept of religion as being more metaphorical. It's not like Jizo appears, puts his staff out, and you grab, and he physically, they understand that he's a metaphorical figure of hope. It's not like you go into the cave and you're actually in the underworld. It's metaphorically, that's what it feels like. I think people are more able to do that. There was a hand, yes, in the black.
How did your family do
In the earthquake? How did my family do in the earthquake? They're fine. Our main temple structure sustained unrepairable structural damage, and the main temple was taken down and a new one built in its place. The biggest concern really was their proximity to the nuclear power plant. They were quote unquote fortunate because the winds were blowing the majority of the radiation away from them. But the radiation levels were still pretty high, so I didn't take my little boy to see them for at least a year until they said, Marie, you can bring him, it's okay. We've cleared away a lot of the dirt, etc. Really, all things being equal, my family was very fortunate. So I kind of feel like I can't complain, because I've now been to so many of these temporary housing communities and seen people who haven't been able to go home in 4 years and are told they're not going to go home for another 6 years. So our family is really lucky. But it has forever changed the complexion of this town, Yes, in the white.
I haven't read your book, but I've heard you now read from it.
Mhm.
And the words are very, very beautiful.
Thank you.
And I hear you talking about your heart
do I always open up myself? Do I find myself drawn to subjects that?
To healing in your heart.
Oh, I think, am I drawn to, I'm certainly drawn to healing. Well, here's the thing, I really love people. I think people are great. And I think people are good. And so but I think it's difficult, you know. And I think living can be difficult. And so I'm probably fundamentally drawn to difficult questions and really thinking them over. I would say I'm kind of a nerd, you know. and have always been drawn to, those hard questions. You know, I lived in New York City for 17 years, and I always think I'm a closet Northern Californian because I believe in the spirit and spirituality, and I believe that people are good, and I'm not really cynical. And then you live in New York, and like winter lasts forever, and it's really hard to carry a stroller up and down the stairs into the subway, you know, and it's really annoying when someone gets on the elevator who doesn't need to be on the elevator, and you have a child in a stroller, and then you sort of think, wow, I've really become a bad person because I'm thinking all these mean things about all these people, and I hate the weather. Life can be stressful and difficult. But I have always very much wanted to see how to live happier, how people can be happier. And you asked if I have always been drawn to opening myself up, and the answer is no. I find that incredibly difficult. I never thought I would write nonfiction. I find it incredibly difficult to talk about myself. In addition to criticizing me for mentioning Darth Vader, reviewers will occasionally say, Mockett is not revealing enough about herself. And I think, oh, that's because I find it really difficult. I find it hard. But what I think is the most difficult questions we face are spiritual in nature. How to be happy, how not to be anxious, how to forgive. I mean, those are all spiritual questions. And I also think they're really old. Like if you look at old stories, everybody has the same problem. You know, they're mad at their family, they're jealous, they're in love, but they're not loved back. I've never been loved. You know, it's all the same sort of emotional problem. And people have then spent centuries thinking about how to address these questions. And that's the beauty of really probably of any religion and of any religious teaching, is at its core, someone tried to come up with some pearl of wisdom to help us or to make us feel better. And it doesn't always translate well because it's archaic language. But I've always cared very much about that because, as I said, I like people. I fundamentally believe in them. So, are we done? Okay.
Thank you, Marie. That was really wonderful, and I think you all have a good idea of what is in her book. And because you are all pleasantly buzzed on espresso coffee, and the Lido Village person is there to take your order, Marie's going to be signing books. We hope that you will certainly buy one and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much for coming and supporting the library.